Destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, we could easily say the F6F Hellcat was the deadliest fighter of World War II, yet it remained somewhat overlooked. This is the story of the Acemaker. So to better understand our Hellcat's story, let's quickly explain in what way of combat it was actually used. Carrier warfare in the Pacific was something completely different from any combat world had seen before, like it was fought in a different dimension. The US and Japan were fighting naval battles across the Pacific since Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Here, whoever controlled the air above the water, controlled the water beneath it, and who controlled the waters basically controlled almost everything else. So at the heart of this new kind of combat were aircraft carriers, essentially floating air bases from which were launched small but fast fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. They would attack either naval or ground targets wherever needed, or scramble to fight off enemy air attacks and protect their own naval formation. This concept was extremely effective. However, it depended on the effectiveness of the aircraft they carried, and that's when United States encountered the first big problem. That problem was the Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's primary carrier-based fighter. When the war began, the US were using mostly F4F Wildcat and already were looking for successor. But by the time it faced Zeros, Wildcat proved to be dangerously underpowered and inferior to Zeros flown by experienced Japanese pilots. American fighters were outmatched in dogfights and dying in alarming numbers. They needed something much better, and they needed it now. The answer would come from the Grumman company that was already building Wildcats, but this time they would start from the ground up to create something that would just outclass Zeros. As we said, the US was already looking to replace Wildcats with something better, and work on what would become the F6F Hellcat actually began before they formally entered the war. But everything changed when Americans got their hands on a nearly intact captured Mitsubishi Zero after a forced landing. They would completely redesign this new aircraft specifically to counter Zero's threats and exploit its weaknesses. The captured Zero was thoroughly examined and then flown against US aircraft in mock fights to see how exactly to defeat it. The Zero was incredibly agile for the time. It could outturn almost anything, with great range and extremely small weight. However, these advantages came at the cost of armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and weak structure. Speed was its biggest weapon, but when hit with anything, that was about it for the Zero. So Grumman went back to the drawing board. This time, they didn't try to outmatch the Zero, they built something to kill it, and well, a couple thousand downed Zeros later, it's safe to say they did. The fighter they came up with had an enlarged airframe, a raised cockpit for great view for spotting the enemies first, among many other features crucial for carrier operations, like folding wings for saving space, wide-set hydraulically powered landing gear, and so on. By the way, in Wildcats, pilots had to manually crank up the landing gear after takeoff, which was quite dangerous and physically demanding in a vulnerable moment. Hellcat introduced a hydraulically powered landing gear system that made pilots' lives much easier. Through some improvements back and forth, the Hellcat was ready for war in just 10 months. It was mass production optimized, and 12,000 of them would be built in just 2 years. To put that in perspective, the Hellcat went from blueprints to combat deployment in less time than most modern fighters take to complete their initial testing phase. The Hellcat was not the fastest fighter of the war, it was not the most maneuverable, it was not even the most technologically advanced. So how did it achieve that absurd kill ratio? The Hellcat excelled in 3 critical areas that determined survival in the Pacific Air War: firepower, protection, and dive performance. Grumman was making important adjustments to the Hellcat based on the pilot's experience as well, to tailor it specifically for the way of operations it was used in. For example, it had a slow stall speed of just 84 miles per hour, which is the speed at which lift is not enough to keep the aircraft in the air. This made dangerous landings on carriers easier and safer compared to Corsairs, which had to approach at much higher speeds. Now, completely opposite to the Zero, Hellcats were twice as heavy, with a maximum takeoff weight of 15,000 pounds, 7,000 kilos, very well armored with self-sealing fuel tanks. They were made to sustain and survive massive punishment, with a windscreen resistant to small arms fire and more than 200 pounds of armor around the cockpit and vital engine components. This made the Hellcat able to survive basically anything besides a direct hit from a 20 or 30mm cannon and limp back to its carrier. There are documented cases of Hellcats returning to carriers with over 200 bullet holes and significant structural damage. One famously limped home with half its wing missing. But because of the weight, the early Hellcat was still outmatched in speed by the Zero until it got the new engine that would change everything. The supercharged double Wasp 18-cylinder radial engine gave it more than 2,000 horsepower, and with massive 3-bladed propellers, 13 feet in diameter, the Hellcat could now go past 390 miles per hour in level flight. Besides internal fuel tanks, it could carry 3 external drop tanks under the wings and fuselage, giving it a range of about 1,000 miles with full combat weight. The standard armament consisted of 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing with 400 rounds of ammunition. This gave it severe firepower and a dense field of fire optimized for air-to-air combat, spitting about 20 pounds of lead per second. 1 second burst was enough to shred an enemy fighter. Later variants had a combination of 220mm cannons and 450 calibers, which were very effective for downing larger targets like bombers or strafing enemy ships or ground targets. Besides that, the Hellcat had hardpoints under each wing and the fuselage where it could mount 500 or 1,000-pound bombs, unguided rockets, and even torpedoes. It could carry up to 4,000 pounds of external ordnance in total, so it could serve in many roles, not just as a fighter. But as a fighter, it would excel and go down in history as arguably the deadliest of World War II. The F6F Hellcat made its combat debut on August 31, 1943, during a US Navy carrier strike on Marcus Island in the Central Pacific. The aircraft launched from the light carrier USS Independence and scored its first kill shortly afterward, downing a Japanese Kawanishi flying boat. Though this initial engagement was relatively minor and met with limited resistance, it marked the beginning of the Hellcat's combat career that would quickly scale into a dominant force in the Pacific. In the months that followed, the Hellcat was thrown into increasingly intense combat. The first real test came during the raid on Wake Island in October 1943, when Hellcats downed 18 Japanese aircraft for the cost of 2 of their own. But it was during the operations over the Gilbert and Marshall Islands later that year where the Hellcat proved itself decisively. During a key engagement over Tarawa, nearly 50 Japanese Zeros clashed with a smaller group of Hellcats. The result was 30 enemy fighters shot down at the cost of only 1 Hellcat. While the Zero remained more agile at low speeds and in tight turns, American pilots were trained to avoid engagements if they weren't going in their favor. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics. Hellcat pilots would climb, then dive at high speed, make 1 firing pass, then zoom, climb back to altitude. The Zero simply couldn't follow in these power dives without structural failure, which played directly into the Hellcat's strengths. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in a massive carrier clash between the US and Japanese fleets, the Hellcat cemented its legacy. The Navy was able to detect incoming Japanese air formations long before they reached the fleet, using its radar advantage. This gave Hellcat pilots time to climb and intercept. What followed was an aerial massacre that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 2 days of combat, US pilots shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft, and the vast majority of those kills were credited to Hellcats. In contrast, the Americans lost just 29 planes. This battle effectively destroyed Japan's remaining naval air power. Perhaps the planes lost were less of an issue than the critical mass of skilled pilots that the Japanese would never be able to replace. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, and the Hellcat was at the center of it. Hellcat pilot Alex Vrasu shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in just 8 minutes. When he landed back on his carrier, he held up 6 fingers to indicate his kills, captured in one of the iconic photographs of the Pacific War. The famous 19-to-1 kill ratio requires some unpacking, however. In raw numbers, Hellcat pilots claimed 5,163 aerial victories, while losing 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. But like all wartime statistics, this deserves scrutiny. Japanese records were largely destroyed at the end of the war, making confirmation difficult. Post-war analysis suggests American pilots may have overclaimed by as much as 25%, which is a common phenomenon in all air forces during the conflict. Even accounting for overclaiming, however, the Hellcat's performance remains extraordinary. A more conservative estimate would still put the ratio at 13 or 14 to 1, which is still the highest of any fighter in the war by a substantial margin. However, what makes this ratio even more remarkable is that it was achieved mostly by so-called green pilots, young and inexperienced new pilots produced hurriedly through the shortened Navy training program. But the Hellcat was simple, stable, and easy to fly, which made it perfect for newer pilots with little experience to become aces quickly, some even in a couple of minutes. It also got the nickname Ace Maker because it produced more aces than any other Allied aircraft in World War II. An ace was a pilot with 5 confirmed aerial victories, and over 300 pilots became one in Hellcats. On the other side, Japan's situation was worse by each day. After sustaining those catastrophic losses, they shifted more to kamikaze attacks, and outdated and poorly maintained fighters were flown by young, inexperienced pilots. With the introduction of long-range radar and with Allied numerical superiority, the situation was now desperate for the Japanese. But as jet technology was starting to emerge, piston engine fighters were at their final chapter. The F6F Bearcat would be its replacement as an even faster and improved version, but arrived too late to actually see combat. And the future of fighter aircraft after World War II shifted to jets like the F-8 Phantom and F-9F Panther.